entitled Looking the Thing in the Face, Slavery and the Public Landscape in Charleston, South Carolina, 1865 to 2010. And just because we are fairly far from Charleston, and I'm not sure everyone's been there, I thought for point of reference, I would just quickly show a map, because part of the argument of this paper is that two particular parts, two particular public spaces are pretty significant when we're looking at commemoration and slavery in Charleston. And I've circled them there. The first to the north of the peninsula is Hampton Park. And the second, towards the center, is Marion Square. And what's important about this, you can kind of get a sense of this from all the small blue peas, which are public parking places, is that Marion Square on the bottom is right in the center of historic Charleston, where millions of tourists show up each year. Whereas Hampton Park, although in a densely populated area, it is far from where most tourists go. I would say it's fair to argue that few tourists venture much above that middle line in the center of the peninsula. So it's fairly isolated, and that has something to do with the argument that I will make. Henry Darby arrived at Morris College in August 1971, a proud resident of Charleston, South Carolina. During his first days on the Sumter, South Carolina campus, Darby frequently bragged about his hometown to his fellow freshmen, many of whom hailed from rural areas. Darby's pride, it seems, attracted the attention of one of the historically black college's coaches, who called him up in front of the whole class at an early orientation session. The coach asked if he was from Charleston. Darby said yes. The coach asked again to be sure. The freshman confirmed that he was a Charlestonian. The coach then posed what Darby now describes as a, quote, profound question. Well, he asked, who was Denmark Vesey? Darby was at a loss. He replied, Denmark who? Soon he was running out of the auditorium with tears streaming down his face, for Darby was, in his own words, quote, ignorant of what this man had done in the very place I was born and raised. That a black Charlestonian like Darby, who grew up in the 1950s and 1960s, had never heard of Denmark Vesey, who was executed for plotting a slave rebellion in the city, is not entirely surprising. Charleston, arguably the capital of American slavery, had worked hard to avoid candid discussions of its slaveholding past since the 19th century. When Scandinavian writer Fredrika Bremer visited the city in 1850, for example, she lamented, I scarcely ever meet a man, or woman either, who can openly and honestly look the thing in its face. Nowhere is this fact more readily apparent than in the public landscape of Charleston that emerged in the late 19th century and persists to this day. Take a stroll around downtown Charleston today, and you will not find a single public monument or memorial to the enslaved who called this city home. In 1996, Henry Darby began a campaign to change that fact. He and a few colleagues argued that Charleston should erect a monument to commemorate Denmark Vesey in his effort to lead an aborted slave uprising in 1822. Their proposal set up a long and divisive debate that had not been settled. While Darby and others view Vesey as a freedom fighter, some opponents see him as little more than a would-be murderer. This contemporary battle over Charleston's public memory and landscape, over what should be remembered or forgotten, memorialized or ignored, is one that has been fought before. What I'd like to do today is survey some earlier episodes to show how Charlestonians have struggled to define the city's history through the public landscape for a century and a half. I'll conclude by returning to the Denmark Vesey Memorial with an eye towards unpacking the ways in which the conversation about Charleston's public memory has and has not changed. Charleston's struggles over how its history of slavery and race relations would be remembered in the public landscape date back to the Civil War. In the spring of 1865, local African Americans and their white allies built a cemetery, built a cemetery for over 250 Union soldiers who had died in a prison camp at the Washington Racecourse, which is now Hampton Park, the park that was to the north and west, and had been buried in unmarked graves. Aware of the, quote, symbolic power of the planter aristocracy's racecourse, as David Blight writes, local blacks were determined both to acknowledge the sacrifices of the Union dead and to transform the public meaning of their final resting place. By creating a proper cemetery in which to bury the prisoners, Charleston's black community put the final nail in the coffin of slavery. Several dozen local men built the burial ground, topping the entrance gate with an archway on which was written, "Martyrs of the Racecourse." On May 1st, 1865, tens of thousands of people, mostly former slaves, gathered to dedicate the ceremony. White Charlestonians were no doubt unhappy with this memorial to those who gave their lives to end slavery, but their precise response is difficult to determine with certainty. What is clear, however, is that local whites had an altogether different vision for the future of the old racecourse. In the immediate wake of the cemetery dedication ceremonies, they launched a campaign to return the track to its former glory. These efforts paid dividend in short order. The cemetery quickly fell into disrepair. Starting in 1875, crowds again flocked to see the horses run at Washington Racecourse. By the early 20th century, White Charleston found another purpose for the space. Jumping on the World's Fair bandwagon, the city held the 1901-02 South Carolina Interstate and West Indian Exposition there. Aiming to increase international trade, the organizers of the expo unintentionally exposed another side of Charleston, the ongoing struggle over how the city's racial history and politics would be represented publicly. One of the attractions of the expo was the Negro Building, whose exhibitions were overseen by local African Americans. But the expo's white board of directors put their own imprint on the building, or more accurately, in front of it, by commissioning a statue to grace its entryway. Envisioned as a tribute to blacks and their role in the fortunes of the New South, the sculpture, entitled The Negro Group, image of it, consisted of three figures. In the middle stood a woman balancing a basket of cotton on her head and holding a pitcher of water in her hand. Excuse me. On one side was a kneeling, shirtless man resting on a plow with one hand and leaning on an anvil with the other. You can sort of see them in the front. His face was sculpted to resemble Booker T. Washington. Can't see here, unfortunately. Flanking the woman on the other side was a younger man strumming a banjo as he sat on a cotton bale. The statue sparked controversy even before the expo opened to the public. Reverend F.W. Robinson of Mount Zion AME Church, who led the opposition, complained that the statue portrayed blacks as menial laborers. Thomas E. Miller, the president of a local black college, viewed the statue as a white declaration of African Americans' proper place. The young man playing the banjo, whom Miller called a, quote, blank idiot, was particularly troubled. The statue, he continued, quote, is being condemned by every hopeful, aspiring, self-respecting Negro of both sexes, unquote. To many black Charlestonians, the statue was an affront, a symbolic check on black ambition, black ability. Protesters, therefore, insisted that the Negro Group be removed. Some went so far as to threaten its destruction if the requests were not honored. White exposition directors and the local press, for their part, complained that the black opponents of the Negro Group were being ungrateful and unreasonable. The Charleston News and Courier had little patience with the entire episode, condemning, quote, the more ignorant of our colored fellow citizens for criticizing a statue that was not only, quote, excellent from every point of view, unquote, but also true to life. Still, the white managers